Welcome back to Taiwan Outlook. Our guest today is Dr. Dean Waters. He's the chairperson of the Initiative and Referendum Institute in the U.S. Dr. Waters, we've been talking about a controversy surrounding Taiwan's referendum. And as we know that the international attention has been paid to this time's Taiwan referendum on UN membership. What's your take on that? Especially the U.S. government has been very opposing to Taiwan's move to have a referendum on that particular issue.
I think it's very frustrating that when the international community, especially the international community that supports what a true democracy is, when they come out in opposition to the use of the referendum. And it's not technically the use of the referendum process in Taiwan, it's the subject matter.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in the United States, for example, our government is very concerned that the subject matter will be offensive to Beijing.
Yeah.
Is that frustrating? Yes. I mean, the American public strongly supports, from the polling that we've done or that we've seen, they support Taiwan's UN membership.
Mm-hmm.
Prominent think tanks in the United States feel strongly that Taiwan should have the right to join the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And so it's very frustrating, the U.S. response in opposition to the use of the referendum process. Mm-hmm. Many people in and out of government have argued that, you know, the United States, we're involved in so many different issues that it's a matter of priorities. We just don't have the priority to deal with the Taiwan issue. But the reality is it should be an issue for the Taiwanese to decide. Mm-hmm. And it honestly should be irrelevant what the American government feels, mm-hmm. because, you know, Taiwan has shown that it's a true democracy, is practicing and using one of the true democratic tools available mm-hmm. to it. And the international community honestly should be in support of that.
But does that happen all the time, that some other countries say to another country that you should not have referendum on this and on that?
It's very rare. I mean, it's very rare for a country to specifically say, there has been a lot of dissent in the United States about, you know, what's going on in Chavez, you know, and how he's using the referendum process. So that's on him using the referendum process illegally in their minds and not as a tool for the sovereignty of the people. But it is extremely rare. Actually, mm-hmm. I don't know of a single case where a government has come out and says, hey, it's great to have a democracy, it's great to have the referendum process, but you shouldn't use it on this specific issue. Mm-hmm. It's unheard of.
Mm. How about China's reaction? China has been very concerned about any referendum in Taiwan because they are afraid of a referendum on Taiwan's future in the end. So what's your take on that?
Well, the whole cross-strait relations and the issue with China is one that eventually at some point in time has to be resolved. I mean, mm-hmm. it is. I find it quite interesting, you know, that everybody in the world refers to Taiwan as Taiwan. I mean, we have the Taiwan Relations Act in our federal government, you know, and China's response, China is not a true and open democracy. They mm-hmm. don't believe in the referendum process. They're one of the few countries around the world never to have held a national referendum on anything, mm-hmm. and so it's not unusual for China to express some concerns, but it is disheartening that the American government is kind of endorsing and following along with China's disdain for the referendum.
Are you saying that, you know, in some people's eyes, that the U.S. is helping China to constrain Taiwan's democracy? Do you think that's a fair, description about what's really going on here?
Well, I think that the U.S. reaction is not helping rein in China. I don't think the U.S. reaction in any way is being beneficial to Taiwan. Mm-hmm. I think that the United States, listen, it's not easy being in the State Department of the United States and having to deal with the multiple issues that are being dealt with. I mean, you know, China has close relationships with Iran. I mean, Russia has close relationships with Iran. We got the whole issue dealing with North Korea. I mean, mm-hmm. So it's always, and in any society, it's always a give and take. I mean, where do you throw your support and where do you need your allies? I mean, mm-hmm. but all that being said, regardless of whether there may be practical reasons for the State Department to feel the way they do, it's very disheartening for literally the millions of citizens out there who live in an undemocratic regime to see how the United States is actually responding to the Taiwan situation. I think it's a perfect opportunity for Taiwan to, quote unquote, kind of put China in its place and say, listen, this is an emerging democracy. You know, they can be an example for other countries around the world. You know, we should support them. So it is frustrating, the fact that the United States is more in bed with China on this issue than in Taiwan.
The referendum initiated by the DPP, the ruling party, is that it asks people whether Taiwan should apply for the UN membership under the name of Taiwan. So if that kind of a referendum is passed eventually, what do you think the U.S. will react?
I think the United States will only react based on how China reacts. Mm-hmm. I think that if the referendum were to pass without any opposition from China, I don't think that the United States is going to do anything. I think that if China responds, I think the United States response will be specifically tied to China's response. Mm-hmm. Does the United States hope and wish that the referendum would go away? Yes, but it's not. I mean, when you already have 2.6 million signatures on something, you can't erase that. You can't take it away. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe, I think one of the critical components in the United States is that, that there needs to be greater information provided to the citizens of the United States about Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is, most citizens don't know about Taiwan. My mother, when I said I was coming to Taiwan, she said, have fun on the beaches in Phuket. I mean, she didn't even know, you know, but I think that only when we do a better job at educating the American citizens about Taiwan
mm-hmm.
will that put pressure on the federal government to make a change. In absence of that grassroots support, do I foresee the United States making any wholesale changes in the foreign policy between
mm-hmm.
Taiwan and China? No, I really don't, because there's no real impetus for it to do so.
Some people in Taiwan argue that maybe the U.S. government is not willing to see a democracy in Taiwan because, you know, it complicates the whole situation, complicates the relation between the Taiwan and the U.S., between Taiwan and China and so on. So they wish, especially from Beijing's perspective, they wish democracy in Taiwan to go away. Do you think that's a reality?
I think that the United States response to Taiwan is because it is a thorn in its side, not because it's a democracy, just because of its relationship with China.
Yeah.
I think that if China were not, you know, had no problems with Taiwan, then the United States would have no issues at all with supporting a democracy in Taiwan. I mean, the U.S. government, you know, U.S. government has on occasion been accused of supporting democracy when it's convenient for them, you know, not necessarily as a unified philosophy, and it is frustrating. But I think that, I mean, the reality is, you know, what are the options? I mean, Taiwan-China relations at some point in time have to be dealt with. Mm-hmm. If Taiwan fully declares its independence, will China invade? It's a possibility. I mean, will the United States respond? You know, who knows? But the reality is, as I said earlier, the responsibility, I mean, it's you know, it's honestly up to Taiwan and the leadership of Taiwan to decide their course. And, you know, as I say, let the cards fall where they may, because the United States, the support or lack of support for Taiwan by the United States, honestly, in my opinion, shouldn't be the litmus test about whether or not Taiwan proceeds forward with declaring its independence, quote unquote, or not.
Yeah, but for some people, in face of a non-democracy, a democracy is usually very vulnerable because, you know, it's very easy for the non-democracy to infiltrate, you know, to penetrate the society in a democracy. What's your take on the current democracy Taiwan versus non-democratic China's dilemma?
Well, from the standpoint, I think that, you know, Taiwan is a true democracy. I think that it's what I would consider an emergency democracy. That there's still some give and take that has to. You know, the legislature still has a disproportionate control of the country than the people. I mean, you know, and I think the referendum process is going a long way in changing that. I think that as far as China is concerned, I mean, China is not a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. I think the long-term hope of the United States is that as capitalism goes forward in China, that as people accumulate wealth and the citizens and a growing middle class emerges, that in itself will lead to a greater desire for democracy in China. And I think that that's the long-term hope. I mean, the United States truly wants China to be a democracy. But I also think it's important that that the United States, I mean, Taiwan in this region is one of the best democracies that there is in the Asian community, and I think that's why it's very important that the gains of the democracy in Taiwan not be erased by a lack of support from the United States.
Is there any role that Taiwan can play in terms of helping China to become a democracy?
Oh, I think clearly. I think that, you know, what you're doing is an example. I think, you know, one of the key things, of course, is an information exchange. I mean, it's a matter of how much information the Chinese, mainland Chinese, to know about the Taiwan situation. But I think that it's critical that Taiwan continue down the path of democracy. And I think that if you know, there's a lot of opposition to the DPP, the KMT, or whatever it may be, but in a true democracy, you know, that freedom of speech is very critical. And I think that if Taiwan can come through this period of holding these referendums, maintaining civil control, maintaining a true democracy, I think that will be a shining light for the Chinese. And I think that, you know, as more Taiwanese invest in China, and I think as that cross-cultural exchange may continue, I think that you know, mainland Chinese will see Taiwan and see the freedoms that you have here versus what they have in China. And I think that will only help bring about democracy in China.
One of the unique designs in Taiwan's referendum law is the so-called defensive referendum. In other words, the president can initiate a referendum bill. Do you think that's you know, good design?
You know, there are pros and cons to it. I think that you know, it's always good to give the leadership of a country different tools of democracy to use, just like it's important for the citizens to have their different tools to use. As long as as long as whatever tools available to the president are used in a fair and balanced method, and that are in the citizens' best interest, then there's nothing wrong with it. As long as that individual or the president or vice president or whomever doesn't abuse those tools. But the reality is that whatever tools available to the president should be available to the people. And I think that if he has greater use or ability to use a referendum, the citizens should have the ability to use the referendum as well, which is why I think it's very important that the legislature reform the referendum law to allow greater citizen involvement.
One of the most worrying development for China is that maybe in the future, someday in the future, people in Taiwan will cast their votes on the future or the nature of relationship between Taiwan and China. In other words, independence or unification. Do you think that's a possible option for people in Taiwan?
Well, anything I think is an option. I think that I think at some point in time the Taiwanese just there needs to be the consensus. Hey, we want to break away completely and totally independence from mainland China or not. If you put it to the vote, one of the difficult things and what the unusual thing about Taiwan is that when you do have public votes on things, there is a concern. There's no doubt that people are human in Taiwan. That okay, if I vote in support of total independence, will bombs start falling on my house tomorrow? I mean, that is an anomaly in Taiwan that you don't have in other countries. But I do believe that that the Taiwanese people need to decide that for themselves and need to decide. Listen, we want to be a true democracy. I mean, the reality is, it doesn't matter what any other country in the world thinks. It doesn't really matter what China thinks. I mean, if Taiwan wants to be truly independent, they should be truly independent. I mean, as far as most countries I travel around the world, they view Taiwan as independent. I mean, you have your own legislature, your own government, your own economy. You have your own voting rights. You have your own infrastructure. I mean, everything. I mean, you are about as free of a society as they come in this world. And so, to even have to argue and debate about your official name, being worried about what mainland China thinks, I mean, it's got to be a very difficult thing for Taiwanese. But I think eventually it has to be resolved. And I do believe that it's in Taiwan. I do believe strongly that Taiwan should eventually completely and totally break away from mainland China.
The democracy in Taiwan has come a long way. I think, as a matter of fact, this is the only second time that Taiwan have the referendum together with the election, full election. But some people suggest that in the long run, referendum will become a way of life in Taiwan. So there will be all kinds of issues being put on for referendum. Do you think that will be the case in the future of Taiwan's democracy?
I think that as citizens take a greater interest in their government and believe that their vote matters. I mean, it all boils down to whether or not they believe their vote matters. If you have a referendum process where they cast votes and nothing ever changes, then yes, that will lead people to think that I shouldn't participate because it doesn't matter. But I think that as the democracy expands and the referendum process is used more and people feel empowered, I mean, yes, it will probably lead to greater use of referendums. But if you look around the world and the fact that there may have been 800 national referendums in the last 150 years, throughout the entire world, I mean, it's hard to imagine that referendums will control every aspect of and be on every single ballot every single time in Taiwan. You have a lot of people out there who love representative government no matter what and believe that direct democracy in any form is wrong, and they're going to raise these concerns. Well, what happens if every issue every day is voted on via the referendum process? Could it happen? Theoretically, yes. Will it happen? It has not been the case anywhere in this world, in countries that have experienced and had the referendum process for centuries. But I do think that as the citizens feel more empowered, they will use the referendum process more, as long as they have a process they can use and is not a birdcage referendum as referred to. But the bottom line is, what's wrong with that? The citizens are putting issues on the ballot, so be it. They are the sovereign. They are the ones who get the right to make those decisions. And I think it would be a great testament to the international community if Taiwan were actually get to that point.
Finally, voters turnout. Although we don't have the compulsory system, but the voter turnout is also very high. 70% or 80% of people cast their votes. But some people say that we are too much involved in politics, so it's not a normal way of democracy. What's your take on that?
You can never be too involved in democracy. You can never be too involved in government. I think it is. That's another example of Taiwan being an example is their voter turnout. I mean, in the United States, we struggle with 25 to 45% turnout sometimes. Because they become very lackadaisical about it. But I think that you can never be too. Citizens can never be too informed and too involved. I think that it's a great thing, and I think voter turnout is a wonderful thing, and hopefully, as long as the government continues to show that their trust in the people, I think you're going to have a high voter turnout. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
President Walter, thank you for coming to our program, and thank you for your very insightful analysis.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Taiwan Outlook, and see you next week.